Well, I think my earliest memory was actually at the very, very beginning of the war, that with all the airplanes that came in and flew over the housetop. And I remember my mother took me over to the window and said, I don't know if she said this is a war, because I probably couldn't understand. I was 3 years old, basically. And I think that's my earliest memory. But
1940?
1940, yeah, in April. April 9th was
April
when
9th,
the war
1940.
broke out in
Yes.
1940. And I turned 3 in February. So I was just I was 3 years old. So that is actually my earliest memory. But during the war, we had a large sailboat, and during the war, because they were bombing the harbor in the town where we lived, we moved the sailboat to a small island up a fjord about 100 kilometers from our hometown, and it was stored there together with some other things. We would go there. My father, we had RAF soldiers that had been shot down there. They were housed in with us. They would come in and they would stay for a couple of days and they would take off. So sometimes my father would come home and he said, okay, we have to leave now. So we just had to pick up everything, and then we went to that little island where the boat was stored, because there were no Germans there. And that was just part of what it was like.
For how long did you stay?
Well, sometimes we stayed there a couple of weeks, and I didn't go, they took me out of school.
How did he know when to get back?
I don't know. I mean, he had connections, I'm sure. But there are many things that happened during the war, that were so different. Like they took my school, and so we had to, because they brought women and children to Denmark because there was food and relative quietness in Denmark. And so they housed them in school, so they took the school. And we had to go to school in another place. I had to go to school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and rode my bicycle. And a friend of mine who lived in the same apartment, and he was sitting on the back of my bike, and we biked to school. It was about a couple of kilometers from home. And we sat in the basement most of the time at the school because of bombardments. So, and I remember my parents had some friends that had a farm out in the country somewhere. And of course everything was rationed. So we would get, in the fall, at the time when they were slaughtering their pigs, we would drive. My father had a truck, so we would drive to the farm at night without lights on and pick up a pig, and then we covered it with tarps in the back, and then my mother would can the whole pig. She would can the whole pig.
I don't think that there's so much I remember until the beginning of the war. But I remember 9th of April. This is somehow something that I think most Danes are either caused to remember or are told what to remember. I'm not really sure where it all comes in when you are a kid 4 years old. At any rate, I remember being separated from my brother. It appears either I was sick with something or he was sick. But they always separated us. When one was sick, we didn't want the other one to be sick. So as soon as you got suggestions, then you were moved. And I was moved into the living room to the sofa, and I slept there. And I remember at 4 o'clock in the morning, my dad comes rushing up from the bakery. And there was a thunderous noise in the air, and he got me out and he said, look at the airplanes. And they were so this was just at the break of day. It was about 4:30 in the morning, and this was in April, so it was kind of just beginning to get like a little bit 5 o'clock. Yeah. And there were lots of German airplanes, and He was very excited about that and didn't really know what to say about it, but he was just, I remember him being excited and waking me up. So that moment stands pretty vividly in my mind. The Germans, of course, were taking over the large airport outside of Aalborg, which was the closest airport, functional airport to Norway, that the Germans were also invading at that point in time, where they met a much fiercer resistance than they did in Denmark, where the flat land they could just roll over. And all of those Danish islands in Denmark and Germany had a non-aggression pact, which of course was completely and totally ignored. The Danes, I think, fought at the boundary for 4 or 5 hours, and it was totally useless because they had nothing to fight with. And so the Germans just rolled over and invaded. But Aalborg was a key place for the Germans because of his situation with his airbase and also because of his harbor. So his harbor was about 30 kilometers inside a fjord that pretty much cuts the peninsula of Jutland in half. And the central city in that area was Aalborg. So good harbors, and you could bring in a lot of material, and then you could fly it to Norway, to where they began development the airfields there. A few years into the war, when the Allies were finding themselves and beginning to do more than just defend Great Britain, and began to turn it around, and they found places that they needed to deal with. Aalborg was one of the places they needed to deal with. And so the RAF, the Royal Air Force, many of the planes manned by Danes, flew in and bombarded the airport. And I would assume also some of the shipping in the harbor. They sometimes missed their target. But I remember that especially from 42 through the beginning of 45, frequently the alarms would sound, the sirens would go, and my father was the captain of the ship in our apartment building, which incidentally was built by my father and my grandfather in 1932. Dad then was in charge of getting everybody into the basement. So there was a basement below the first apartment. So we were sitting down there in the basement until the signal came to get up. And always it happened at 2 or 3 o'clock in the damn morning. It was a very disturbing thing for young kids to have to get back down into the basement. Yeah. The war years were kind of strange because my dad was a baker. The Germans who also bought at the bakery. So Dad made the usual array of Danish breads, usually half a dozen different kinds of breads, and lots of Viennese type of Danish cookies and pastries particularly, and those lovely gooey cakes. The Germans loved it. Sometimes they loved it too much. And I remember going to school one morning, and I'm coming down the steps to go out the shop entry. And there's a separation in the room between the bakery that lies lower and the apartment that lies higher. Kind of stepped up into this room, then you can step into the bake shop, where my mother and usually one other lady worked. Well, they were in the bake shop here. This was probably around 8 o'clock in the morning, when the door burst open and 2 German soldiers come in and point their guns at everybody and says, "We want some cakes." Not money, mind you, cakes. My mother screamed. My dad comes rushing up from the bakery, and he talks tough to these German soldiers. And they're pointing guns, and he says, "I'm calling the police." And he called the police, and they ran. And the police came a little bit later. At that point in time, this must have been around 1943 or so, because the Danish police had already been carted off to concentration camps. And that's another story that begins a little bit earlier, but this is what happened to us.